this particular module, because we want to take a look at, we want to study the uncanny valley. We want to take a look at the effect of stylized characters, because we are going to be learning the techniques to create digital models. And we're going to try to bring to bear everything that we know that is wrong about our perception of digital characters into our workflow and see what we can do to explore that in terms of solutions. The whole Brainstorm Ben 10 toy was one too. Golden Compass is good for convincing CG, I think, but they might have to do with never seeing some of the animals before in real life. The Golden Compass, I know some of the guys who worked on it. They worked really, really hard on it. So it's the pinnacle of, at the time, of pure artistry in terms of bringing those animals to life. But we'll talk a little bit about that. So I said that the lasting power of a lot of interpretation of characters in terms of their emotional connection with us happens in sort of the stylized kind of characters. But there are other things that we can do. Well, let me put that question to you guys. So if you were tasked with creating a photorealistic character with current CG technology, taking into account what I said, that CG tends to not age very well. In a couple of years, you'll be able to spot that it's CG. So how would you, as a digital artist, create a photorealistic character that is memorable and lasting? What would be your first protocol? Stylized, more cartoony look. Falling back on a stylized and cartoony look is partially the answer. Well, one of many ways of approaching it. Now remember, we have to do a photorealistic character, right? We can bring those stylized principles of animation into a photorealistic character, right? So what we can do is we can improve the performance of the actor by finding stylized lines within the character. And I'll talk to you guys in visual studies about C curves, S curves, arcs, straight lines, and et cetera, right? I'll talk to you guys about the O'Reilly method and through curves that go through the entire form. Now, we'll go back to Gollum. So if you were to see, and they do have these split screen videos on YouTube. If you were to see Andy Serkis's original performance alongside Gollum, at first glance, when you play it back at speed, it looked like complete facial capture. It looked like complete body capture. Now, if it was just that pure performance capture that Andy Serkis tends to talk about, well, then why have animators? What did the animators do for Gollum if it was all Andy Serkis? Were the animators put on hiatus? What did they do? Bring more emotions to the character. How? They still have to adjust the face for face shape. So were the animators just fixers? Did they just clean up the motion capture, as Andy Serkis has claimed? No, actually, I don't know if it was Andy Serkis. I shouldn't attribute it to him. Andy Serkis has become a bit of a defender of animators, so it's all good. Exaggerate. Yes, that's probably very, very close to what I'm driving at. There would have been some things the actor couldn't do. No. Don't ever tell an actor there's something they couldn't do. No. But I see what you mean by that. Maybe there were certain facial tics or timing that they couldn't quite do. But then that leaves the animator as an enhancer. They adjust it. So an animator just adjusts stuff. Remember, animation is an art form. Remember, you're an animator, right? If you're an animator and you're given a data set of Serkis's performance, and the animation director said, yeah, here you go, you just clean it up. Just go into the graph editor and delete all the curves that you don't need and just tidy it up. Right? So if you're just tidying the animation, then what is the point of it? So I'm going to go back, actually, to the answer exaggerated. That is the art of animation, right? The art of animation is to take existing movement, motion, the way we sort of amble through life, and stylize it as much as possible. They improve it. They make the character believable in that world. Yes, absolutely. And again, they add facial tics. They add little punctuation and timing. They add all kinds of stuff. So let's go back to a comment that was made earlier that Gollum looked feral, right? Now, there are two ways that this is accomplished. Okay. So there's two ways this is accomplished, right? So number one, you've got Andy Serkis's pure performance, but Andy Serkis will only ever look like an angry human being, right? And of course, that gives us a lot of emotion to build on as an animator, right? Then you got the modeling team that creates these jagged, misshapen teeth. That also works iconically as having us think or sort of idea associate to a feral rabid dog or wolf or whatever. So we get that idea that this is an animal, right? Why do the shapes of the teeth give the impression that the character is feral? Well, because teeth only get that shape when subjected to a diet of raw meat, right? So, this is like the nth level of research that we go to in terms of putting our characters together. They're still required for textures and stretching pores. Stretching pores. Okay, somebody's watching VFX artists react. Bloody stretching pores. I can talk to you guys a little bit about skin shader development in Electronic Arts. So let's have a look at what makes Gollum feral, right? No, not there. Let's go a little bit. Okay, so this is going to be quick, so I want you guys to pay attention. This is where the animator comes in, right? So, in that particular shot, there's a head shake, teeth clench, striation of masseter muscles. Okay, now that's the animator doing their thing, right? Watch again. See that? Head shake, clamped with the teeth, masseter muscles tensing. Yes, tensing of the face. It's not, I draw on the masseter muscles, but you're absolutely correct. It's the whole face tensing up in a particular way. Twitching gives an uneasy vibe. Yes. Right? Yes. Making the eyes bigger. Yes. Well spotted. Yep. Yeah, in this example, yes. In this example, it is about capturing all what Chuck Jones called the minutiae of detail. That's not necessarily picked up in the mocap. You're absolutely correct. But it's not just simply accenting the the minutiae of the movement, right? It's accenting the minutiae of the movement to supplement an emotional state for the character. Quick movement of the eyes. Now, let's dive into this. And no criticism at all, because you are absolutely correct, right? So, quick movement of the eyes creates the feeling of it being feral. Why? This is really important from the point of view of an animator. Yes, thank you. Looking for escape or looking for another avenue of attack. Being alert? No, you got to go beyond that, right? As an animator, you got to understand what your motivations are. What is it that you're looking to do? Triggering fight or flight? Absolutely. That's bang on, right? Eye movement makes the character realistic. Yes, but we're talking about why and what it is that we're trying to explore. Adrenaline, yes, absolutely a factor of it. But what brings the human interest, yes, rush of adrenaline, I absolutely agree. But what brings the human interest in is, what is that character going to use the adrenaline for? That's why we sit up in our seats. Because we want to see what that character is going to do next. Right? We don't just want to see them high on adrenaline. Right? So, now watch the eye movement here, right? Okay. Play it again. So not this clip. This one here. Just watch. Did you see the point where Gollum changed his mind from feral to despair? Did you see it? Okay. Again. I'll go a little bit further because I think it's important that we try to see the whole thing. So here. Yes, the mouth twitches. We see that decision that he makes when he switches from fight to flight. We see that decision. Why is it important that we see him switch from fight to flight? Why is that important? Character building. Yes and no. To make a relationship with the character, yes. We start to relate to character more. Why? Fear, anger, frustration, and the switch is to give the viewer pity on Gollum. Yes, yep. That's all kind of working for me. Let me put it to you this way. You guys have seen all kinds of futuristic Armageddon, cyborgs take over humanity kind of films, the Terminator being a classic example of that. So when does a robot cease being a robot? Yeah, it makes him more human-like, and we're going to get to the reason why. When it stops behaving like a robot. Stops acting logically and starts acting... When given human qualities. What are those human qualities? Emotion? I wasn't expecting that answer, but I'll agree with you guys. Emotions, right? Emotion, yeah, definitely. Here's what I was gunning for. Oftentimes, free will, which is based on being able to choose for yourself, right? So a robot ceases being a robot when they become self-aware, when they become sentient, right? When they think, or when they are capable of thinking. So let me ask again, why is it important that we see the switch from fight to flight in Gollum? Shows he can think. We stop looking at him like a CG character, and we start looking at him as a human. That's why it's important to see that thought transition. Yes. Because of little moments like that, yes, now he's more relatable. Because of moments like that, we stop seeing the technology and we start seeing the character. That is what we're trying to do. Yes, we get an insight into the internal thought process. That's beautiful That's exactly the spot you want to be because he's a computer graphics simulation. He doesn't have internal thought processes. And yet when we feel that, that's when the modeling team and the animation team have done their job and they've nailed it, right? So we are looking for that internal thought process in the characters, right? So this is really important. You'll see me bring that up in terms of visual studies as well, right? And it harkens back to this idea when you're creating characters, they have to be living, breathing, and thinking on their own, right? So I'll kind of give you segueing into visual studies, but this is really, I'm very passionate about this, and it's really important to me, right? So when we take a look at character design, and we take a look at this, oftentimes you will get, let me just pick, I hate to pick on this artist, but maybe this one. Okay, so let's take a look at this character here, right? Because I used to see this a lot in portfolios, right? Let's take a look at just this guy here, right? A lot of times I'll get character designs like this, which are just explanatory. Standing pose. Front, back, character doing nothing, right? Now, the difficulty I have with this is that we never do this, or if we do, it's very, very rare. When we're standing, there's no way we can stand and do nothing. Even when we're standing, yes, the artist isn't providing any action or facial poses or anything. We can't see who they are on the inside. Absolutely, absolutely. You're bang on the money. You guys know exactly what I am looking for when I'm looking at character portfolios, right? I have to believe that that person exists. I have to believe that they're about to leap off the page, right? So let's contrast that unfairly, but let's take a look at, my favorite is the Overwatch stuff, right? So if we take a look at, even that, right? Even that pose, right? Her legs are crossed for a reason. She's holding her guns out at an angle for a reason. That's part of her personality. We don't see it fully, but there's hints of it there, right? So let's take a look at this one, right? Check that out. That's really good for just a bog standard standing pose, right? So let's see if we can get at the original image. Do you see that? Do you see in this particular pose the massive difference with that one? Same kind of idea, standing pose, holding a spear or a staff, right? Head tilt, lean of the body, facial expression. Bang on, right? You can see who they are on the inside, personality and such. That is what we're looking for when we approach character design, character sculpture, all that kind of stuff, right? And it requires that we think a lot about the personality of the characters, because what we need to do is to create a situation where the character is thinking. The character has an emotional state, and then suddenly your audience buys that that character exists in the real world. And that's ultimately what we want to do. Okay, that's cool. That discussion went on a little bit longer than I was planning on it, but it was good stuff. Really, really good discussion. She seems to be positive from her nature. Yes. So in a single concept art, we have to, and this is one of the unwritten goals of being a concept artist. We have to be able to tell right away a variety of different things. A, her alignment, the old Dungeons and Dragons, good, chaotic, evil, neutral. Except there's no such thing as neutral when you're doing character design. So we got to know that alignment. We got to know the world that they're coming from, the era, etc., all from a single design, right? Whether or not she's agile and athletic has to come through in the design, or they're clumsy and meek has to come through in the design. And it's possible, right? That's all depends on fairly sophisticated posing. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what software we're going to use to kind of endeavor to do this. Well, not really. The software is all kind of bog standard stuff. It's, Maya, ZBrush. And we'll talk about software issues for you guys because not everybody will have access to the tools. I'll talk about that. But today I want to talk a little bit more about the theory of how to approach 3D character design. And I think one of the things I'll do... I generally tend to explore a lot of other artists, but I throw my own stuff up there just because I believe an artist worth their salt should put their money where their mouth is and, you know, not be afraid to kind of bring their stuff to bear as well. So let's pop into CG characters. And then we'll go to the ArtStation homepage as well. ArtStation. We'll go to the ArtStation homepage where a lot of this stuff will put my work to shame, but there you go. All right, so that's a good one. Let's talk a little bit. Oh, no Sketchfab? You know what? Let's go Sketchfab, actually. Sketchfab's better. Go right to the source. Let's filter that down to just characters, and this one looks cool. Pop that on. Yeah, that's really good. Okay. Oh, and we got Physics Sim on this too. That's cool. Right on. Actually, that doesn't have enough costume on her for me to talk about the relationship with clothing design and that's Maya firing up. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Oh, this got animation too. Okay, well, you know what? We'll talk about this as well, right? Because there's animation to it, it becomes a little bit more difficult to talk about, but thankfully it's not a lot of animation. This is not bad, right? But it's not for... I'm not trying to bring up the Sketchfab examples for us to talk about the quality of the artist and what they've achieved. Just to talk a little bit about a new way of visualizing your character designs. So when you design a character model sheet for me in Visual Studies, the next thing that you have to do is start to think about little things like, how does that character rotate around? What sort of profile do we have for the front-on design that I have, right? So if I were to come in here and take a look at this, there were a few small things that I picked up straight away. The one massive issue with this character that stands out to me straight away, rotating around, is how flat the front of the face is. It's very flat, right? Although they've managed to describe some good curvature around the lower jaw, so that's all right. And then the curvature around the torso is not too bad, so I can see a little bit of a hint of the rib cage, and the hip tilt is working pretty good, right? It's not too bad. But the point I'm trying to make is that you have to be able to visualize your 2D designs and your characters in three-dimensional space. But not only do you have to do that, the character has to look good from a number of different angles, right? So let's pop over to my maquette over here, right? So this was a class demo, and I sort of roughed out, I was going to do my version of the Hulk, but one of the things that I generally tend to do when approaching a character sculpt is to understand what that character's personality, thought process is, what they're doing at the time, and then I look for really strong dynamic angles, balance, a really, really strong sense of diagonal through the pose, and a whole bunch of other stuff, right? And then I go in and I start thinking about the facial expression and how it complements what the pose is doing and so on and so forth. I even go to the length of thinking about how would those fingers be posed? What is the distribution of the splay of those fingers? And how does it punctuate the through lines that travel through the entire character, right? So that's kind of our goal, kind of in a nutshell. There's a lot more that I'm going to teach you about how to attack a CG sculpture with a lot of the artist sensibility of the 2D artist, right? Yeah, he's buff. I was the anatomy guy at EA as well. So anytime there had to be any sort of musculature and Hulk-like characters, I usually ended up with 2 character assignments. Ones that featured a lot of muscle and anatomy, and female character designs, right? So that was kind of my thing. It's a good segue for you guys. Man, I'm going on tangents a lot today. Holy cow. Okay, so one of the things about why I became the go-to person for female character designs was I could not draw female characters. And it's not me. I've noticed this seems to afflict all artists. Do you find that you have an easier time drawing your own sex in a character and the opposite sex is a lot more difficult? I've noticed this. Yeah, and there are psychological reasons for that. No, that's fine too, because it's not a blanket, it's a generalization, right? So some people are comfortable with either type of character. But generally, because we grow up intimately familiar with our own physique, it is easier for us to draw our own kind of sex. Now, invariably, what I've noticed is that there is a tendency for female character designers to draw effeminate men, and for male character designers to draw bulky, square-jawed female characters. That's generally where it starts. And I was of that sort of nature as well, right? So I decided I didn't want that as a weakness anymore. So I tackled it for an entire year, where I did nothing but draw female characters for an entire year of a variety of different styles as well, right? So that's the one thing that I can recommend to you guys. If there's a tricky area or a weakness in the way you do your designs, you can conquer it just by sheer weight of numbers, right? Yeah, bulky female character. It's difficult. It's tricky. But I do have some things that I've learned along the way. And these are the types of female characters I draw now, right? So I think I got there. Right? This was during my period where I was still learning how to draw effeminate female characters, right? So, and then some other most wanted drawings. But I really started to kind of enjoy that after a while, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. This one's a bit of a miss, but I really enjoy this one. I think that design worked really, really well. This took me a good day or so to do. What do you advise to do to learn how to correctly draw anatomy? I'm not going to give you advice. I'm going to teach you, right? So if you're not good at drawing people, I'm going to teach you too, right? So one of the things we do in visual studies is we go through anatomy. We also do it here for the modeling sort of segments of my lessons, right? So don't worry about it. And you got a full 3 years to learn it. So don't sweat it. We got plenty of time. And I'll give you some of the exercises that I learned along the way to help with that sort of thing, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the basics and what we are dealing with, right? So I'm inside of Maya. Don't worry about it. I will give you, I'm sure Phil will give you as well, an intro to Maya sort of session. So I'm coming over here and I'm going to create a polygon primitive plane. And I will talk a little bit about the difficulties that we face as 3D modelers. So I'm just going to pop over here. You'll have to bear with me in terms of Maya. So I have used Maya for a good 10, 15 years. And I got to the point where we were going to get Autodesk accreditation and I was going to register as a Maya master. I know Maya inside and out. But then I've spent the last 5 years inside of Houdini. So I found that jumping back in Maya, I've got a split-second lag in my head to try and remember how Maya works again. So just bear with me. I do know what I'm talking about. Okay, so one of the things that we have to talk about is this polygon plane in CG space and what it is that we are trying to do. Animation isn't timetabled for me. Oh, okay. Maya, love to crash. Yeah, the thing about Maya is it's very, very resource intensive. So just keep that in mind. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to create a light as well. And I'll talk a little bit about the surface, the various surfaces that you have access to inside of a 3D environment. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to create a camera. Now, the reason why I'm laying this out super quick is just to show you the relationship inside of 3D space of what we are dealing with. So let me also come into pop into my rendering editors and open up the render settings. Right. Okay, so to deal with beginning to create computing game development. Oh yeah, okay. Oh, I didn't know I had computing students in this particular session. But that's cool. Cool. A lot of the basics are things that we'll need to consider. Oh no, not you game development students. You're from Rich's course, right? So it's the Creative Computer Games Design, right? You're not from the Computer Game Programming course. Are you guys from the Computer Game Programming course? Game design. Yeah, don't worry. You guys belong here. Yep, Rich's course, yeah. Which I also teach on. There you go. Animation master. Okay, so for those of you guys who have never been in a CG environment before, I'm going to run you through the basics of what you're dealing with in this environment in terms of creating a CG character. What you have is a surface, a light, a camera, and your renderer. That is the relationship. Oh, sorry, and the shader, and then the renderer. That's the relationship for creating CG objects. And let's see if I can explain this to you. So first of all, we have a surface, and that surface is a mathematical simulation, right? And what that surface does is, oops, let me see if I can grab that light. There you go. That surface reacts to light. That's it. That's at the core of 3D simulation, is this idea that there is a calculation that simulates how light reacts on a surface. Now, I'm sure you've heard various other definitions of polygons and things like that, but ultimately, I start here because in the end, we have to understand the process of rendering. We have to understand what the renderer needs, what the renderer calculates, and what eventually ends up on screen. And the best way to look at it in the beginning is this understanding that we are creating a surface that simulates reaction to light, right? That's pretty much it. So one of the ways we control that surface reaction to light is through its material or shader. And I'll explain the difference between a material and a shader in a second. So let's come over here and I'm going to, let me see if I can pop over to my attribute editor here because it's a lot easier to talk about with the attribute editor. So in here, we have a material called a Lambert. Now, the Lambert material is, again, another computer science definition of how that surface reacts to light, right? So there's all these mathematical formulas about how light's reflectance properties react with things like material, like clothing and things like that. So a Lambert has a particular function where it does not emit a specular light, right? So what is a specular light? Well, I'll show you the difference. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to right click on my material, and I'm going to assign a new material. And you can see Maya gives us quite a few different materials to play with, and I'll explain that in a second. So a Phong is a material with a different mathematical formula describing how a surface reacts to light, right? So now you can see, oh, whoa, that That surface looks shiny, almost like plastic, right? So that is then calculated from the point of view of the camera. Let's pop over into our camera's point of view, right? This is important, not just yet, but it is important later on when I talk about screen space, world space, object space, and how those calculations translate across the board, right? And then the information that the camera collects from the surface, from the light, and from the material that describes how that light reacts is then sent through the camera to the renderer, right? Now, what is a renderer, right? What is the purpose of a renderer? What's a renderer's primary job? Some of you guys have 3D experience. Can you tell me what is a renderer supposed to do? You guys will be surprised by the answer, but I'll let you have at her in the chat window. Yep, calculate. What is it calculating? Yes, light. Yes, absolutely. Polygon count. Yes, it does, but it uses the polygon count data for something else. Light and shadow. Yeah, absolutely. But to what end? What does the renderer then do with the light and shadow calculations? Thank you. Yes. It colors pixels. It goes and it takes the data and it says, what color do I need to make that one pixel on the screen? I will tell you why. And I might repeat myself with this, but let's go for it anyway. So let's take a look at Photoshop again. It's the best way to kind of understand this. Wait a minute, Wild Strawberry. You're Alicia, aren't you? You're cheating because you've taken this course before. No? Oh, okay, sorry. Wrong guess. No, Wild Strawberry. Don't know who you are, so I'm just sort of guessing. But you're absolutely right, coloring the pixels. All right. So this is sort of another obvious concept about computer graphics that, you know, is obvious when I tell you, but you probably not considered before, right? So let's, you may have. All right. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to, I use this in my ZBrush lecture as well. Calculate, put into images. You're very close. Yes, very, very close. Okay, so I'm going to draw this. Actually, let's pick a better, just a flat brush, right? Yeah. Okay, so I've drawn a line here, right? So I'm going to come over to Photoshop's filters, and I'm going to stylize, emboss, right? So I've done this stylize, embossed, and I've created a 3D line. Or have I? I haven't, right? Whoops. All that I have done is told Photoshop, or all the filter has done is told Photoshop what color those pixels are, right? And that's what makes it look 3D. Now, a piece of 3D software does that at the frame rate of your computer. What I'm trying to tell you is 3D space does not exist. Even though we're working in 3D software, this 3D space is an illusion. It is being it's being translated onto what's called the 2D proscenium space. So what we are actually interacting with is a 2D image. Now, you don't really need to know that per se for your careers as 3D artists, but it's good to have an awareness of what's going on in the background. And I will bring that more into light once we dive into ZBrush. Right? So this is being faked. Now, this is why, unlike other tutorials out there, I generally tend to lead in with light, because those light and shadow calculations determine what color each pixel is on your screen, and therefore, in my opinion, the more important way to think about rendering. Now, what this does is it also puts in your head what this does is also puts in your head that there is a relationship between material, light, object, surface, camera, and rendering. Because far too often in a lot of other 3D courses, people think about texturing as separate from materials, as separate from the geometry, as separate from lighting. And it's not true. What ends up happening is if you think of those things as separate, and you go to render, and your render crashes, you'll be like, I have no idea what's going on. The renderer just cocked up. I don't know, maybe it's a crappy renderer, right? Yes, you can render them separately, and you can do render passes, render layers. I'll get into all of that, right? But ultimately, you're playing with 2D images in the end. Right? So the one thing about understanding that there is a relationship between materials, lights, and a surface is that instead of having your renderer crash out and you go, I don't know what's wrong with my renderer, there's some sort of issue or there's some sort of render setting, you start going, maybe I'm using the wrong material library. Maybe the lighting calculations per pixel across all the vertices of that surface is a little bit too much for the renderer, right? So it gives you a better understanding of how to problem solve what's going on with your renderer if you know exactly what the relationship is between those various areas inside 3D. Right, so that is why I wanted to give you guys the background. Now, here's something I'm going to blow your mind even further. The renderer is not part of Maya. It's a separate program. It's a separate application. It is like a program inside of a program. It's like if you were to go into a Word document and insert image, that insert image function is actually Photoshop. Blender has 3. Yep. Yeah. So for you Blender guys, you guys know where I'm going with this, right? So yeah, renderers are actually separate pieces of software that you can bolt onto Maya. That's why you can have different renderers inside your 3D program. Some of you guys might not know that, right? So you might have heard, oh yeah, so and so's rendering with Redshift, somebody else is rendering with Octane, and et cetera, et cetera. We render with Mental Ray, and you're like, well, isn't it all Maya? Well, yeah, it is all Maya, but you can buy separate applications that you can bolt into Maya, and they'll appear here as a renderer, a separate renderer, right? Now, Maya has since gotten rid of Mental Ray, thank God, because it was really, really buggy, and bought Sony's Arnold renderer. They bought it, and they put it in Maya. So now Maya can render using Sony's renderer. We can use Pixar's renderer, RenderMan. We can use, again, Octane, Redshift. You may have heard of Maxwell, Brazil. There's a whole slew of renderers out there that you can buy and integrate into Maya. Right? Hopefully I'm not blowing too many brains out there. Now, why I call them separate applications, Brazil is another renderer. I have a story for that. I'll talk about that later. But the reason why I refer to those as separate programs and not plugins is because you can launch the renderers on their own as standalone applications, right? You can also take one installation of Arnold and have it feed into Nuke, Houdini, and Maya all at the same time. So it is its own application, right? So having said all that, Maya does come with a few that the Autodesk guys made. Maya software renderer, Maya hardware renderer, Maya vector renderer, right? So that sort of comes bundled in. And then obviously Arnold is now offered for free, which is cool, right? So a lot of times when you guys go up to rendering, you might be like, oh, which one? What is all this stuff, right? Well, don't really worry about it, right? We'll get to that later when we talk about rendering and what rendering is and how to set it up, right? So this is the slave driver of everything that we do, right? We do everything for our taskmaster, rather, is the renderer. Everything that we do for the renderer. Now, I hope you see the logic of why I'm teaching you this way. When I say that, if we come in here and we go into our Hypershade, and from this I'll talk a little bit about materials and shaders. We go to Hypershade, right? If we go, I'm going to use the Arnold renderer. Well, then Maya says that's cool, but there are specific materials in Arnold that go with the Arnold renderer. Because remember, I said it's a relationship between the lights, the materials, the camera, and the renderer. So if you want some nice renders, it behooves you to use Arnold's materials, Arnold's lights. You can see that we have Arnold lights in here as well, right? And they work in tandem with the Arnold renderer. Now, Arnold also supports the Maya materials and Maya lights and things like that, so you can use just the bog standard ones as well. But I just want you to understand the relationship between the materials and the shaders, the renderer, etc. Right? Everyone with me so far? I'm trying to give you a gentle sort of theory background to how Maya works. Right? I know some of you guys are sort of advanced Blender users, so I apologize if this seems a little rudimentary, but we'll get there. We'll get there. Okay, cool. So the last thing I want to touch on is what is a shader, right? So let's undo this. Oh yeah, I got my Cintiq up here. That's good. Okay. Just as an aside, I've got the Cintiq set up in my son's room, and he used to do loads of drawing, but now he's just using it as a third monitor, and that really annoys me. It's not a monitor, kid. All right. So I'm going to where's that open window? Oh, there we go. Okay. I don't know why. You know what? I don't know why I went to Photoshop for this, but there you go. This is the best way to wrap your head around it in the beginning, right? You guys may have heard of materials, textures, shaders, etc., and just not quite sure what is what or how it all works. This is a shader, right? A shader is a relationship between a material, a texture, and how that pumps through the RGB channels. So let me dial it back and I'll explain the difference to you. Right? So we talked a bit about a material. So what does a material do, right? Well, a material talks about how light reacts on the surface. It can get quite confusing. Oh, no, actually, I'll leave it simplified, and we'll get into the exceptions later on as you guys get more comfortable, right? So that's all a material does. But I don't know if, let's switch back to a Lambert, right? So I'm going to come back and I'm going to reassign my Lambert, right? So let's say this is a brick wall, right? So all I'm doing is telling that surface that this material reacts to the light as if brick would. Now what we need to do is we need to color it and paint it, right? Make it look like brick, because this doesn't look like brick. That's where the texture comes in, right? So you got a few different ways of texturing. You can poly paint, which is actually painting on the vertices, but we won't talk about that because it's used maybe 25% of the time. And then there's hand painting textures, which is a lot of fun. but there's also using photographs to texture, right? So let's go take a look at this shader, and I'll talk a bit about it. So some of you guys are already old hats at texturing, so that's all good. So let's pop over. We've got our polygon, right? Now, we've got all of these ways of describing the 3D object inside of Maya. So this is called the attribute editor. I will go back and I will walk you guys through how to use Maya later. This is just an overview or kind of a theory-based thing, right? So the things that make up a 3D object or asset for the renderer to render is the geometry. Now, I haven't mentioned geometry up until this point, so we'll talk a bit about geometry, and then we have the shader. So notice the shader is made up of different things you plug into it, right? And that shader is attached to a material, right? So remember my little Photoshop chart. This is a shader. The shader has a material definition in it. So that's our material, and we're about to plug in a texture, right? So there's our material, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But let's go back and talk about polygons now. So for the geometry, for Maya to understand in 3D space where that light is going, what it's hit, and what colors are bouncing off of it, it needs to know location data, coordinates for where that object is located in space. So we have two nodes inside of Maya. One that describes the shape of the object, loosely, but basically, is this a cube? Is it a sphere? Is it a buff Hulk-like character? And where it's located in space. And it's located here at world 000 in 3D space. So a shape node and a transform node. What the thing looks like and where it is. That's it. That's all that's needed in terms of information in 3D space. This is called a parametric node. I won't talk about that now. It's something that's used in the creation of a 3D object. We won't care about it, so I'm just going to edit, delete all by type history. Boom, it's gone. So this is the sheer essence of a 3D object in any 3D application, really. A shape node, a transform node, and the shader, of which the material is a piece, right? So here's our shader, and there's the material. So only three things make up a 3D object: transform node, shape node, and shader, right? So the shader, well, wow, we've got a lot of things to play with. We can affect the transparency of that object, right? Which is not going to show anything because I don't have anything behind it. The ambient color, the incandescence, which you won't see, but when you render, it'll glow, right? Provided you set a few things first. The diffuse channel, translucence, etc., etc. I'll go and explain those material properties later. Now, again, these are all how that object reacts to light. Transparency lets that light through. The ambient color bounces ambient light back into the room. Incandescence, how this object illuminates with its own light, etc., etc. Translucence depth, we'll talk all about that stuff, right? The actual painting or the detailing of that object comes when we apply a texture or a texture map, as somebody said earlier on. So where do we plug that texture? Into the color channel, because we want to affect the color of the object, right? So I can see here, if I click on this, it's like, yeah, okay, well, I can affect the color, but how do I make it look like brick? Well, by plugging something into it. Now, these are all called channels. If we go all the way to the right, we can see this checkerboard icon. That's your plug. That's your mains plug. You click on this, you can connect anything to this color channel. Anything, right? So, I'll show you. When I click on this window pops up. Notice they're called render nodes. Aha! Because the renderer is the taskmaster. We are slave to the renderer, right? So inside the render node, we can plug in a texture, right? So there are two different types of texture, right? One is the ones that you probably are familiar with. It's just an image or a photograph that you turn into a texture map and you put on, right? So that's the one we're probably intimately familiar with. There are also what are called procedural textures. So these textures are sort of generated using a mathematical equation, right? So I've just clicked a checkerboard procedural texture. Oh, I can't see anything. There's nothing on there. Well, we have to let the viewport know that we have a texture plugged into it. I'm going to turn on hardware texturing. There we go. There's our checkerboard. Now, something I forgot to mention. And I forgot to mention because back in the day, it wasn't as big a thing as it is now. Inside of Maya, you actually have access to 2 different kinds of renderer, right? Can you guys have a guess of what those 2 different kinds of renderer are? Arnold's one, yep. That's referred to as an offline renderer. Close. Not online renderer, but close. Very close. It's the viewport. It's the viewport. Right? How are we supposed to see what we're interacting with here? Well, that's where a real-time renderer is provided. Think of it like a game engine. We're actually looking at a game engine or a real-time renderer inside the viewport. Now, this will get confusing because you can customize and set your viewport or real-time renderer however you want, and they may be different to the settings you set for your offline renderer. Now, it's called an offline renderer, like Arnold is an offline renderer, because it has to go away and calculate before it shows you a beautiful picture. So it doesn't go offline, but it goes and utilizes Windows resources that you don't see immediately. The real-time renderer, you see results immediately, right? So, I mentioned that because when I applied the procedural checkerboard pattern, we didn't see it right away. So we have to tell the real-time renderer to please process the texturing in hardware. Now, what the hardware means is use the graphics adapter. Use the card that you generally use for video games and draw my shader for me. My renders used to take 6 hours in real time. Yeah. You guys are really lucky. Computer graphics have reached the stage where you can work almost one-to-one with your final image. Okay, so that's the procedural texture. But really, we're not interested in that because procedural textures are really quite simple. So I come over here. You can see there's bulge, checker. Even the cloth looks really, really crappy because there are calculations that are happening in the background that help to create that look. We don't want that, right? So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to, let's back this out here. I'll teach you all this later. I'm just going to come in here and break that connection. Right. Okay, so let's plug something else into our color channel. So I'm going to click on the render node thing, and this comes up. Now I have this node called File, right? So if I click on the File node, it says, okay, I'll plug in whatever you want in the color channel. Just direct me to the folder location and the file. So down here, I'm going to go and say, look, let's go find an image. I don't have an image at the minute, right? So let's pop in here and we'll take a look at, let's just say brick. Yeah, I know it needs to be a square, but don't worry about it. We're just going to rush through. I want you guys to see what it is that happens when you just grab an image quickly off the internet. Let's pop this on the desktop so I can just delete it after. Oh, what's a JFIF? I've never heard of that. Man, let's try this one instead. Onto the desktop, and that must be a new file format, a new variant of the JPEG. I've never heard of that. A JFIF. That's crazy. Let's see if that works. I'm going to try it. Must be some new web standard. Okay, so with that downloaded, I'm going to go to my desktop real quick. And yeah, there's something up with that. It's not letting me find it. Let's see if this works. Image not supported, maybe? Oh no, it's there in the sample. Okay, let's see if we can turn on hardware texture. Hardware texture is on E. No, it doesn't like that image file format. Okay. Yeah, we'll talk about links and link dependencies in just a sec. I'm just trying to find a simple brick JPEG. Come on, man. Stop preventing me from downloading photos off the internet. Okay, I must be doing something. Let's try just, maybe it'll just let me save off the thumbnail. The heck is a JFIF? You know what? I'm going to go to textures.com. That's just nice and easy. Okay, so I'm going to log in and go and PBR materials. Let's just grab. Oh no, there we go. Brick. Let's grab something a little bit cooler. Yeah, just do this one. Okay, there we go. Onto the desktop. Okay. I'll talk about pipeline dependencies and stuff for those of you who have worked with textures and things like that in the past. Okay, so it didn't like the JFIF thing, file format, so let's try one from the official textures.com. So I'm going to pop over here, I'm going to grab that textures.com image and apply that. And let's see why we are not. Attribute editor. Ah, the file node wasn't connected. That's what was going. That's what was throwing me. All right. Oh, there we go. Okay. So in a roundabout way, we got there. But I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about this, right? So now I'm hoping you guys who've never been in a 3D context before understand that the material talks about the behavior of light on that surface, and the texture gives us that color information that describes what that object is, right? Now, notice that that object is not reacting to the light, right? Notice that, actually, let me make some adjustments to the light. I'll crank up that intensity. Well, actually, let's adjust, let's give it a linear decay. And maybe actually decrease the intensity. Okay, so when we move this guy back and forth, you can see it's reacting with the surface as if it were flat, right? It's not reacting, the light's not traveling through the bumps and cracks and crevices of the brick, right? So we have an issue, right? And we'll deal with that. We can solve that inside the shader, right? And inside that shader, we have different aspects that we can control to tell the renderer how to react with the light. So for example, we have something called a bump map that says, look, I want to tell you where that surface bumps up and becomes brick, and where that area bumps down and becomes a crevice. But we'll get into that later. There's also an area where we can control the specular highlight, well, not on the Lambert material, but we can control how highlights happen on that material, and et cetera, et cetera. So we've got a large amount of control to be able to describe how light reacts on that surface. But for now, I just need you guys to understand that we have dealt solely with the material. I'll get to the meaning of the RGB later. And the texture, right? So that's what we got plugged into here. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the texture. It is your first external dependency. So what does that mean? Well, up until now, we've built everything on this polygon surface inside of Maya, right? The texture was the first time we had to bring in a file from outside to plug into this Maya scene. This is our first dependency. So what does that mean? Well, I'll come back to the file node I plugged in. Maya says, okay, man, I promise I will put brick on this every time you open up Maya, and I'll grab it from your C users desktop texture. I'll grab it from there every single time. So if you move that texture, or if you delete that texture, Maya will say, look, I went to the C drive, it's not there, so I'm just going to draw nothing, right? And that's a broken texture. So you won't be able to have that link work for you inside of Maya, and your brick texture will be gone, right? But there are ways around it, and most of what that involves is being able to organize yourselves digitally. Right? So you'll create a texture folder somewhere that'll never move, and you'll associate with a project folder that will never move. And we'll get all into that. Naming conventions, directory structures, all that kind of stuff. That stuff is important because studios rely on it. And so I will be emphasizing that as we go forward. Okay, so stepping back again, it's just about talking about how to create those 3D objects in 3D space. So those are the sheer basics of it. Now, there are certain things on a polygon object that we need to explore. For example, I'm going to go into display, polygons, where's my face normals? So, for example, with polygons, or any geometry surface reflecting light, do you guys know that a CG object can only reflect light off of one side? Right? On the opposite side, it can't do anything. Here inside the viewport, we can see the brick texture going right through it. But really, what's happening is that the renderer will render that black because it doesn't know what's happening on the other side. It's part and parcel the way surfaces are calculated inside of any 3D package. There's only one side at any given point that will reflect light. That side is called the normal, or the normal facing side of a polygon. Now there are cheats. I've done cheats as well for dual-sided lighting and rendering and stuff like that, but that's not that's what I want to talk about. Yes, you can have ambient lighting, but there are dangers with that. So the general rule of thumb, and I think it's still applicable for today, but it was applicable for years and years and years. The very first thing we would do when we get into a situation where we need to light is turn all the ambient light off. And it has a lot to do with the fact that when you're lighting a scene, especially if it's a complex scene and you've got hundreds of lights, what the ambient light does is it muddies all of your lighting solution. What I mean by that is that ambient is always on and always contributing. And it gets really confusing in terms of when you're trying to isolate your lights. When you've got your key lights and your rim lights and your backlights and things like that, and your fill light, it can get in the way. So we generally turn on the ambient light as a final touch. And we'll just crank that dial up just a little bit, just to tweak the overall values of something. There are also ambient light being emitted from the material, and you can create a physical ambient light as well. So it can get quite confusing. I don't like ambient lights because of its blanket behavior. It just coats everything, right? Oh, I haven't said that. We did use, on Force Unleashed, we did use ambient lighting to help create a sort of desaturated look to Nar Shaddaa. Nar Shaddaa, yeah, it was. Yeah. So there are uses for ambient lights. I'm just not a big fan of them. Yes, for outside areas. Yeah, see, that's the thing. It's a wonderful way of having that blanket uniform lighting that you get off a directional light. The problem is, when you start getting into specific tweaking of areas. So, for example, if I had an outdoor scene and I needed to suddenly light the characters interacting in a very dramatic way, then I get sort of stuck with the ambient contribution on the characters, right? I'm pausing because I'm debating whether or not to get into this. Do you guys know that when you're looking at a feature film, especially something from a big studio, and they've got an exterior scene, that those actors are actually being lit by something other than sunlight, right? So it's this level of control over the lighting that most CG lighters want and need, right? And again, you would light as you normally would and then slowly crank up the ambient afterwards. Otherwise, the ambient contribution gets quite confusing. But each to his own, right? So if you enjoy ambient light, I'll tell you what, the other thing that was beneficial for me for turning down ambient lighting, it forced me to use image-based lighting properly. It forced me to really understand image-based lighting, right? And once I got used to working with HDRs and understanding image-based lighting, I never needed to use ambient lighting anymore. So the image-based lighting... for those of you guys who don't know, there's actually a way of creating a light from an image. So imagine I've got a sphere, right? Well, actually, it'll be easier to wrap your head around if I just use this plane. So imagine that I created this plane and I put a texture on it, and everywhere the brick color was light, there'd be a light, and everywhere it's dark, there'd be a darker light, right? And the color would be sort of absorbed off the texture, and that would light the scene, right? Yeah, sky domes. It's called sky domes. It's called dome light. It's called environment light. It's called image-based lighting. It's known by a few different names with a few subtle variations for each. But again, we'll get into that. Going down a path I didn't want to go down. All right. So hopefully that encompasses everything that you need to know. Now, I've thrown a lot of information at you, but honestly, I'm trying to simplify getting into CG modeling for you guys in terms of camera, light, object, material shader, and renderer, right? Okay, so another sort of brief overview type thing is that there are now two sort of generally accepted ways of creating CG models or CG assets, right? So I've shown you Maya, which is one. Now, Maya is very much an architectural form of creating an object. So I'll show you what I mean. I'll just come in here real quick, go into edge mode. I haven't talked about sub-objects and that kind of thing just yet. Don't worry about it. We'll get into that. I'm just going to, let's just go edge ring and split it. Let's actually insert edge loop too. I'm going to pop one in here, one in here, one in here. Good. I'm going to come in here, grab that face, and I'm going to extrude that face. And pull that out. Okay, so this idea of cutting pieces into your geometry and pulling shapes out is at the heart of polygon modeling inside of Maya, right? Now, notice straight away, we have these black faces, right? I will get into that later, right? This is part and parcel, one of the many problems you'll have to diagnose when you are using a 3D package. Why is the renderer rendering certain faces black, right? So again, it goes back to the idea that you are dealing with a relationship between the surface normal, its material, its texture, its shader, and how the render reacts to it, right? But basically, when you're in the construction phase, you are likely building your object here. And I'll explain to you all the different tools that are available to you in terms of pulling shapes out and just, being able to manipulate objects and sort of sculpt things out, right? So that's one particular way of dealing with modeling, right? The other is relatively new technology in terms of CG, although it's been around for a good decade and a half, is this idea of digital sculpting, right? So I'm not going to explain ZBrush. It does build on my Photoshop metaphor, and I'll explain that at a later date. But have any of you guys used ZBrush or any kind of digital sculpting package? Nope. Okay, that's cool. Yeah, using Blender sculpting, it's the same sort of technology, underlying technology. So if you messed around inside of Blender with its sculpting tools, that's pretty much it, right? Okay, barely any experience. You guys are going to love this. When ZBrush came around, it also appeared on the market at the time its competitor Mudbox appeared. Now, these two changed the philosophy of how we approach modeling. So their philosophy is, look, modelers are pulling faces, pulling vertices, edges, inserting edge loops, and creating objects, right? I would literally spend like a week working this way until I pulled out enough boxes so it looked like a human somewhat, right? And then I'd start cutting in more edge loops and folding it and making it look more human. So you can imagine how much of an arduous, painstaking task it would be if I were to sit here and just extrude another face. Okay, and then maybe scale this down, and I got to slowly build out an arm, and it would just take freaking forever, right? Yeah, I agree with the sculpting over hand modeling. Yeah, I played around with the Cinema 4D sculpting tools. It uses something called voxel-based sculpting, which is a whole other technology paradigm. It's actually good. Voxel sculpting is awesome. The integration in Cinema 4D is poor, right? So don't give up on Cinema 4D. Once they can optimize the voxel sculpting, it is the way to go, in my humble opinion. But voxel sculpting is so processor intensive. I don't think we'll get there just yet. Well, I do some sculpting inside of Medium, which is a VR Oculus sculpting program that uses voxel sculpting. And it's an incredibly pleasant experience. So I will talk a little bit more about voxel sculpting in a second. Okay, so back to ZBrush. So what does ZBrush do? Well, if I were to hit the Shift F key, we can see same thing, exact same thing. We're dealing with polygons. No different. Guys, there's no difference in this object. Same material properties, same reaction to light, right? All the same calculations. Those calculations have been around for years. There's nothing different, right? What ZBrush allows you to do is to, using a brush, now pull out more than just one or two polys at a time. So effectively what you're doing, and I can hit the Alt key and push in instead, you're effectively digitally sculpting, right? But as opposed to moving single polygons at a time, this brush-based sculpting allows you to move large quantities of them at a time. And therefore, it feels more like working with digital clay. You will learn to hate and love ZBrush's interface because people like to say it's intuitive in the 3D part of the 2.5D program. The UI will be different. Definitions are redefined, which some people praise. This part is needless. People praise it for being different, but it's like reinventing WASD for movement in FPS games. There are reasons for ZBrush's structure that I will kind of get into. It's really funny to me that it's polarizing because it shouldn't be, because the reason why ZBrush looks the way it does is it was originally a production-based tool built on a 2.5D drawing program. Built task specifically, I believe, at Weta. Can't remember if it was at Weta. I'm pretty sure it was, right? So what you will experience when you get out there in the studio is that a lot of production-based tools will not have a UI you're familiar with, because they're purpose built for doing King Kong's facial mask, or they're purpose built for doing the fur on Yorick Burnison, right? So there are reasons why the UI is the way it is. I will agree with you. The UI was very, very uncomfortable for me in the beginning. But again, it's what I said before. It doesn't really matter about the tool. It matters about the artist and how creative they feel in that tool and the stuff that they bring out. Now, there are a few things that ZBrush does that seem awkward at first, but are actually quite good. So for example, I'm just using this as an example. Don't panic if it's too much information. I will teach you slowly and walk you through it. But ZBrush has removed a single mouse click, right? So for navigation, I can left click to rotate. I can alt left click to pan back and forth. With the left click held down, I only let go of the alt and now I can zoom in and out. So it's like, oh yeah, what's the big deal? Other than being awkward and hard to get used to. Well, once I got comfortable with that, I found that I could zip around the model a lot faster than I could inside of Maya. It's actually really, really good. There's no other 3D package where I can rip around the model as fast as I can in ZBrush. It just took a little bit of getting used to. So one of the things that taught me back in the day is to never judge an application until you drive an asset the size of a Mack truck through it. That's the only way to be sure. Nuke the program from orbit. It's the only way to see if it's resilient enough for you. You can't make judgment calls by building a little cube and moving around and going, yeah, it's no good, right? But if you go in there and you build a massive demon inside of ZBrush, that's when you can really tell if it's for you, right? So this philosophy has carried me through a lot of different production pipelines and being forced to learn lots of new software. But I was very open-minded to trying stuff out. So I ended up learning RealFlow for fluid simulations, Naiad for fluid simulations. Naiad became Bifrost, and then suddenly when I had to teach Bifrost, it was good because it was identical to Naiad, and so on and so forth, right? And it's sort of a philosophy or an outlook that I'm trying to encourage for you guys. To not judge a piece of software, to give it a go. It may be uncomfortable at first. The metaphor I use is snowboarding. When you first learn snowboarding, man, you fall down a lot. And it's incredibly painful. And it is hugely frustrating. And many, many, many people give up. I was hugely frustrated and struggled with it. But once you get it, oh my God, something clicks and it's the most amazing thing you can do, snowboarding, right? So it's that kind of a thing. Don't let the learning curve put you off of a new piece of software. Try to work through it, get comfortable with it. It's the only way to be sure if it's for you, right? So anyway. Okay, so we will be diving into ZBrush. It's chock full of wonderful sort of functionality that takes your character sculpting to a whole different level, right? There are other pieces of software out there. I don't think I have an installation on my machine, but I will talk a little bit about it. I'm pretty sure I'm going to check to see. No, I don't have an installation on my machine, so we'll talk about. Any of you guys play with SpeedTree? Oops, let's see if we can just get a quick little demo video. Oh, this is going right to their page. YouTube. If you haven't messed around with SpeedTree, again, it's another sculpting-based package.
Hi, in this tutorial, I'll be demonstrating.
But it's a sculpting package specifically used for creating trees. And guess what? It uses the underlying technology of ZBrush. It's all still polygons, materials, shaders. It's all the same polygons that you use inside of Maya. The same UV coordinates, everything, right? Once you become familiar with Maya or ZBrush, jumping into something like SpeedTree is a no-brainer. Yeah, you should give it a go. It's actually not that complicated to use. That's SpeedTree, right? You also have a package called Houdini. Yeah, you'll love SpeedTree. It's really, really cool. There's while Houdini's opening up, there's also I don't know if this is still relevant. Might be. Oh, it looks like it might be. There's also something called World Machine. World Machine takes a texture, like a mountainous texture or a road, usually a satellite photo, takes a regular polygon just like the one that we created inside of Maya, and it creates new polygons and extrudes that surface up. Right? And it's all the same geometry. I'm showing you this because I tried World Machine. Yeah, World Machine's kind of cool. I was using it as my de facto terrain creator until Houdini started to kick its ass a bit. But the point I'm trying to make is because all of them use the same sort of 3D technology, you can bring an asset from World Machine into ZBrush, into Maya, and back into ZBrush again, and so on and so forth, because it's all the same tech. So if you were to dive down and really understand how Maya works underneath the hood in its base, simplest form, you'll be able to pick up any package. So this addresses that age-old question, which is the best 3D package to learn, right? And sort of intermediate artists or artists who've had a little bit of experience will say, no, you got to do Max. No, Cinema 4D is better. No, you got to do Maya, etc., on and on. The experienced guys, of which I am one, will say it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Pick one and learn it. The other ones will be easy to get after that, right? So if you're hemming and hawing over, should I learn Maya or should I learn Blender? Just pick one. Doesn't matter what it is. That's why you'll find that if some of you say, can I do this assignment in Blender? I'll just be like, yeah, no problem. Go for it. Because the principles are the same. Because the technology is the same. Locating where the tools are, that's a whole other issue, right? So some interfaces are more comfortable than others, and you might get lost in some 3D packages versus others, but it's all kind of cut from the same cloth, right? So we're at 3, so I'll end off with, my Houdini didn't open. Oh yeah, it did open. There it is. Okay. So again, Houdini, same kind of thing. It's just a 3D package, right? So you can come in here and you can create primitives, pop them down here in 3D space. These are the exact same primitives and shaders that are used inside of Maya. It's all good, right? It uses a different way of organizing your work. Do you remember I gave you that lecture on layers versus nodes? Well, Houdini is primarily a node-based workflow. So here's the node graph, and this is where I'd go in and I'd start building my scene, right? So it's a completely different way of working. Now, Houdini is one of those things that we also teach, and it is primarily targeted at visual effects purely because of the way it handles data, right? It does things like explosions, splashes, shatter, destruction faster than anything out there, right? But it does not mean that it can't do character stuff or animation or that kind of thing. It can. I've tried it, but I'm more comfortable with rigging a character for animation inside of Maya. And that's just because I'm familiar with it. Yes, you can shatter stuff inside of Houdini. It's kind of Houdini's thing. That's what it's known for. We have shatter and destruction available inside of Maya. And just like, I don't want to overcomplicate it, but I'll just say quickly, just like renderers are separate programs, and you can choose whichever renderer you want, physics for destruction are separate programs. And so you can plug in different types of destruction nodes inside of Maya. So you can use the bullet node, you can use FEM-based solvers, you can use all kinds of other stuff, right? And so oftentimes in a production pipeline, you'll be creating explosions and shatter and destruction using 4 or 5 different physics engines, right? But I digress. So for those of you who are absolutely new to CG, this might have been like full-on overload. Don't worry about it, right? I've tried to outline some very simple concepts for you. Next class, in this particular class, we'll do a modeling exercise together. Now, I don't do interfacey stuff, right? So I don't sit there and go, here's the shelf. These are all the modeling tools. These are all the lighting tools. This is the attribute editor. This is the... I don't do that because they're dry. It's a dry, meaningless lecture. You guys will fall asleep. What I generally tend to do is I say, let's build a simple object, and I'll peel back the layers of what you're dealing with as we use them. That way you're focused on only small areas of Maya at a time. Just focus in on this one area, learn the crap out of this, then apply it to this, and then learn this area, learn the snot out of that, and then so on and so forth. And that way you can build up your experience and your knowledge working inside of Maya. You guys will fall asleep. Yeah, well, hopefully we'll have an interesting modeling exercise next class, and then we'll kind of build on it. Yeah, this particular module, I must apologize, will probably be the most boring one I teach you, because there are some fundamentals that we got to slog through if we're going to operate inside of a 3D context. But I'm going to balance it out with some ZBrush sculpting as well. So we are going to be learning the two in tandem. Now, here's the difficulty for you guys who've never had experience with 3D software. We will probably need to learn Maya and ZBrush almost at the same time, because in the studio, you will see that in a lot of game studios, the modeling department, they usually have dual monitors. Well, that's because the character sculptors and the prop guys, they usually have Maya on one, ZBrush on the other, right? Other tutors tend to have some agenda. Oh, okay, well, I hope not me. I do have an agenda, right? My agenda is to turn you guys into really good artists, but by working on my own stuff. So you'll find that when I'm lecturing, it'll be my own characters that I use. Because for me, that's fun. So if I can sculpt my own characters, I'm in heaven. And if I can talk you guys through it at the same time, then there you go, right? So my agenda is not to teach. My agenda is to make my own kick-ass characters, but then take you along for the ride, right? Don't tell my line manager. No, in all seriousness, the techniques that I teach you are the ones that I love, that I use to generate my art. So if you like the level I'm at as an artist, you're going to be learning all the stuff that I use, right? And then if you want to take that learning further, which you should, then there are guys who have different techniques than me, who are far superior than me, who are far experienced and things like that. It's a never-ending journey. I myself am constantly looking for mentors, and I have one, and a guy named Sean Varney, and he's a visual effects producer who's worked on all these feature films, and he's constantly teaching me stuff, right? So that's what I love about this particular career path, is it just doesn't end. There's so much you can learn, and it just goes on and on and on. But I love it, so there you go. Do we have to set up our own subscription for the apps so we can use them? Yes and no. Some of them have teaching versions, others do not, right? So in a lot of cases, we will sit down and we'll try to remote into the studio computers, right? I've had limited success with that last year, but some of my students last year could remote pilot ZBrush or Maya using a VPN and dialing into one of the PCs there. If not, I will suggest alternative freeware and open source software that works just as good. Because a lot of what I'm teaching you, I want to be not so tools specific, but more about technique, right? The Blender. Blender's the best example. Actually, if you guys can get a license of Blender and it runs okay on your machine, we'll use that. Some of you Blender users are probably turning cartwheels at the moment. But yeah, to be honest, again, case in point about not judging a piece of software. There's a lot of polarization on whether or not Blender is good or not. And you'll see can Blender be used in production? No, it's not good enough production and blah, 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 blah. And I was just like, screw it. I'm just going to download Blender, install it. It's free anyway. And I'm going to build a character. Boom. Right? That's the only way to be sure. There's stuff inside of Blender that I love. Love, love, love. The grease pencil's awesome. And there are other things that are just kind of the UI is really clunky and how it handles file referencing is a bit clunky. So I can see why a lot of industry guys are like, nope, we can't use it in production yet. But for sheer creation, in terms of sculpting and the grease pencil, man, it's good. So yeah. Corridor. Yeah, I know. Corridor Crew. Yeah, VFX Artist React. Actually, the person to listen to in Corridor Crew is the guy with all the tech info, the one that talks about the stretching pores. That guy knows his stuff inside and out. I enjoy watching Corridor Crew. A lot of my mates who are still working in studio watch Corridor Crew. They're really, really good, especially in terms of theory and stuff. What I like about them is they put a lot of theories to the test in their own private projects. That's the way you got to do it, guys. If you have a theory on how things need to be done, or if there's a piece of software you want to try, Ren, that's his name, Ren, yeah. If there's a piece of software you want to try, do a project with it. And that's what Corridor Crew do. And it's good. That's the philosophy, right? So if you guys haven't heard of VFX Artist React, I highly recommend it, right? They talk about, what I like about them is they talk about stuff me and my mates used to talk about in private in the studio halls and stuff like that. So if you're wondering if they're industry relevant, they're bang on the money. They have an animation episode too. Ooh, I think I'll check that out. Yeah, keep watching their stuff. They really know what they're talking about. They've sent... No. The stretching pores is the thing. Yeah, it's just... the stretching pores things harken back to... I'm sort of making fun of myself, right? The reason why... I'm going over here, but I'll end on this story. The reason why I laugh about the stretching pores thing is that when I was working on skin shader development for a character at EA, I met the guy who was responsible for the digital doubles in the Matrix and the Super Punch. His name is George Borshakov. And what he taught me was that skin textures look CG on a lot of characters because what they don't take into account is color temperature changes in the face. I was like, what? So he showed me his test that he did for Agent Smith. And when Agent Smith goes, ah, and screams, the minute his mouth opens wide, his skin texture changes. So I was like, damn, okay. And straight away I went and I animated texture changes to mimic that sort of color temperature change. And I just kept talking for months about color temperature changes and skin textures. So when I hear Ren talk about stretching pores, it kind of reminds me of me. So that's the only reason why I brought that up. It's almost a self-deprecating chuckle. But yeah, skin temperature changes. The idea behind that is now you're going to have to practice your observational skills and find that attention to detail, which some of you had when you noticed the wrinkles in Gollum and all that kind of stuff. And when I pointed out the little shake in the head or the little muscle striations and things like that, that's where you guys are going to have to start to live, by examining those tiny, tiny little details that take us from the out of the uncanny valley to a believable character. It's all in the details, yes, but enhanced by performance. Because remember, at the end of the day, we're trying to get an emotional connection with the audience. Okay, I'll wait for the last few things in the chat. They also redid a bunch of shots from films. I started watching that. That's really, really cool. There's a few VFX artists out there doing stuff like that. There was one VFX artist by himself who did a better face replacement on Robert De Niro than what we saw in The Irishman, and he just did it in Nuke with facial tracking and texture painting and stuff like that. So I thought that was phenomenal. So I really recommend, if you guys are into it, trying to recreate shots from your favorite movie and seeing if you can make them better. Yeah, you learn a lot, actually, just by taking shots from your favorite movies and just trying to replicate them, getting them to look exact. That in and of itself is incredibly hard, and you learn a lot doing that. Best texture. Let's walk like sticks, it will look wrong. Yes, absolutely. All elements intertwine with each other. If any one part of the work is lacking, the rest will lack. Yes, that is the unfortunate thing about being a CG artist, right? It is a tightrope walk. It's kind of like you're walking a tightrope, spinning like 20 different plates at the same time. One of those plates drops, you fall off the tightrope and everything goes, right? So yeah, that's one of the frustrating things about CG. I ran into that. I just did a visual effects alien splatter for a director in London, and it didn't go through because the fluid just didn't look right as it was coming out. It moved like fluid and stuff like that, but it reacted almost like jelly, right? So the still frame renders were approved, right? The director was like, yeah, that looks like blood and gore and stuff coming out of the alien. The carapace of the alien's cracking. It looks good. But the minute I hit play and did just a low-res proxy render, no, the fluid didn't look right. And I didn't have enough time to fix it. So yeah. And that was months worth of work just to get up. Nope, it's not working. So yeah, that's part of it. That is part of the job. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. I keep going over with you guys because you have such engaging chat conversations, and you ask all the right questions. So it's all good. And thanks. I'm glad you like these lessons. I'm enjoying them as well. So. Okay, cool. Yeah, no worries. My pleasure, guys. I've got loads of stuff to tell you and teach you and talk to you guys about, so it's going to be a good year, I think. Okay, that's it for me. I'm going to let you go, guys. Thanks a lot for playing, and we'll talk to you later. Cheers, guys. And it's also here on the Twitch stream, so as a matter of record, so you can go back and refer to it later.